All right, hi everybody. My name is Adam Hain. I'm going to take a few minutes to discuss my IIP project, which I called Instructional Designer Use of Digital Tools in Construction of Learning Environments. So, um, the reason why I'm interested in sort of holistic learning environments is because of my personal experiences working with the LMS, both as a student and as an instructor. Um, Working with various LMSs and in corporate environments as well, and facing some limitations both in terms of the rigidity of the LMS and also some limits in the way the LMS can integrate with other tools. So if there's an affordance that I was looking for, or as an instructor, or looking for to provide for instructors as an instructional designer, a lot of times I find that I was unable to provide that affordance because the LMS either didn't provide it or didn't integrate with a third-party tool that we wanted to use. So those are the instances that really got me thinking about if there's a better way to sort of deliver the environment, either by integrating tools in a better way with the LMS, or sometimes looking outside of the LMS altogether. So self-regulated learning is a topic that comes up a lot in the literature of in online and blended learning environments. Now, self-regulated learning literature is not necessarily concerned with holistic learning environments like some of these other topics are, but I think it's important because, and why I included it in my literature review, is because I think that those self-regulated learning supports, especially when provided by digital tools, can really have a positive impact on that holistic learning environment. So this provides a little bit of a backbone of scaffolding and support when you're building these online holistic, looking at these environments in a holistic way. So I also looked at the perceptions of the LMS. Now there's not a whole lot of literature that I found, especially about perceptions of the LMS by instructional designers, but there is a little bit about the perceptions from students and some from faculty. But what you do find a lot of in the literature, especially when you look at the personalized learning environments literature, is a lot of, and this was especially back in around 2006 through 2012, is that there's a lot of critiques of the LMS, and pretty harsh ones too, as Web 2.0 tools began to be developed, and we start seeing the consumer acting as the producer, both in terms of a faculty member and as a student. We start to see people want to use these tools and integrate them into their teaching, both students and faculty, and facing limitations, especially in that time, in what the LMS could do. So we see a lot of critique of the LMS. And so that's why that literature pertained to my project. Another thing we see in personalized learning environment literature is a sense of autonomy in students creating the learning environment themselves. So being able to choose some of their own tools in a way to show their learning. And an example of that would be something like creating a blog in something like WordPress and letting the learners choose like what blog platform they want to use, whether they want to use Tumblr or WordPress or something like that. So another part of personalized learning environments would be the dynamic of formal and informal learning, and I'll move on from there. So we looked a lot at multiliteracies and e-learning ecologies this semester as well, and so I'm sure you're all going to be familiar with that from looking at it this semester, but I thought that was really relevant to my topic because the work by Cope and Calantzis really look at these different constructs of creating a holistic learning environment with the things like active learning and multimodal content. Now, the next generation digital learning environments are very similar to that in the sense that it's also a framework with different constructs that are meant to provide the affordances needed in the future digital learning environment. So this was a concept that was put forward by EDUCAUSE about 4 years ago, and it's gotten some traction, but there hasn't been a whole lot of research into it in terms of actual like NGDLEs created. So moving forward, my research questions had to do with how instructional designers perceive the LMS and its integration with pedagogical tools. So in this sense, I'm talking about the tools within the LMS, but also a lot of the sort of third-party tools. What digital tools do instructional designers use? What are the challenges that instructional designers face in integrating tools and pedagogical practices into online and blended learning environments? And what are the characteristics of the institution in which instructional designers work? So those are my questions. To answer these questions, I did a survey that we created. So I wrote it, and I took a little bit of it from a couple of other surveys with their permission, but pretty much had to do it all myself because none of the surveys that I found really addressed the same questions that I was looking at. So the survey had 4 parts to it. So there was a set of questions about perceptions of the LMS by instructional designers. There was a set of questions about the different tools that they use. So, and these were all like Likert style items. So looking at like a set of 10 tools for each of those, and whether the instructional designer, the participant, uses those tools in online environments, whether they use those 10 tools in blended environments. So there's 5 questions about the tools, and each of those questions went over the 10 tools that I chose. So an example of some of the tools might be collaborative writing, for example, something like Google Docs. Discussion boards, everybody knows what that is. So I went over 10 tools. VR and AR was another one. I went over 10 tools and asked 5 questions about each of those 10 tools in a way that was a matrix style question in Qualtrics. Now the third section was free text survey items. So that's where I answered the question about the challenges. Third question, I'll talk about that in a minute. So that all was free text, so I analyzed it using qualitative methodology. And for the last part of the survey was various demographics. So what's the size of your institution? Do you have blended and online courses? How many faculty members are at your institution? What job roles are important to you as an instructional designer? All kinds of that kind of stuff. And also basic demographics like age and gender and things like that. In terms of collecting the sample, I went to a couple of different listservs. So the POD network and EDUCAUSE and the OLC, and I distributed the survey via their listservs. I also distributed the survey on LinkedIn through groups by those same organizations. And last, I distributed the survey on Twitter with the hashtag instructional design. So how I went about answering the questions was, so I broke them down into these four questions again. The first question had to do with how instructional designers perceive the LMS and its integration with pedagogical tools. So if you remember, the section 1 that I mentioned was all Likert style items about perceptions of the LMS. And section 2 was about tools. So I got those basic descriptive statistics, and I was able to use that to define basic perceptions of the LMS. But I was also able to merge the variables together in various ways and do a Pearson's correlation and run various t-tests as well. So what I did was put all of the perception questions together for each participant. So they had a total score of perception, and I broke those variables into high perceptions of the LMS and low perceptions of the LMS. And so I had a 2-level independent variable that I was able to run t-tests with, and I ran that variable against the perceptions of the tools, or the usage of the tools. So for each of the tool questions, I was able to see whether people who had high perceptions of the LMS or low perceptions of the LMS used that tool less or more. So I ran that for all 50 of the tools by questions. And the correlation, I did kind of the opposite way. So I did a whole score for each tool. So the score for collaborative writing, for example, and I ran that against all of the LMS questions. So to see if there's any correlation between the various LMS questions and the total use of tools. So I added the use of all the collaborative writing questions together. So I would have like total use of that tool. So the next question, it was more just about which tools did they use. So I was able to use descriptive statistics for that. And I just sort of sorted the different responses by mean and looked at them in various ways to see which tools were used more and which tools were used the least. By the way, discussion boards and collaborative writing are used by far the most of any tools. VR, social annotation, and social media were the least 3 used of all of them. And in terms of the last question, there were various findings. In the correlations, I found some weak connections. I also found that, as you would probably expect, people who tend to really have positive perceptions of the LMS tend to recommend the use of discussion boards and collaborative writing, things that are, well, especially with discussion boards, things that are like in the LMS. People who have lower perceptions of like the affordances of the LMS tend to use tools that aren't typically in the LMS, like social media and social annotation. So keep moving. In terms of qualitative data, I broke the data down into 11 codes. I won't catalog them all here, but some of the codes were interoperability, integration, budget, universal design for learning was a really common one. Faculty development was another really big one that I had a lot of responses for. Open educational resources, challenges with technology, and affordances of outside tools. So I was able to get a lot more context using the qualitative data to be able to look at those questions. In terms of the demographic questions, I just looked at the descriptive statistics and reported it with like basic pie graphs and bar graphs. I just wanted to see sort of how the instructional design participants went across the spectrum. So I didn't mention, but I got about 130 participants. In terms of my research questions and bringing it back to the existing literature, one thing that I was one of the biggest findings was that perceptions of the LMS are very, very high. The LMS is also pretty much universally used, so that agreed with the literature that I found. Now, despite the LMS perceptions being high, there was also a lot of qualitative data that expressed frustrations with the LMS, and quantitative data that said that people like to use outside tools. So one of the conclusions that I sort of was able to draw was that while perceptions of the LMS are very high among instructional designers, they also like to use outside tools. So the two aren't mutually exclusive. Um, I didn't find a whole lot of evidence in the qualitative data that supported the use right now of self-regulated motivations for using those tools, so motivations in supporting self-regulated learning. And I didn't find a whole lot that referenced the personalized learning environment literature in terms of that student autonomy concept that I was talking about. But collaboration is also a big theme in the personalized learning environment literature. And I did find that, that collaboration between student-student and student-teacher was mentioned all over the place. In terms of e-learning ecologies, some of those constructs, and I mean, it's such a broad framework that you could really apply it all over the place, both in the qualitative and the quantitative data. But active learning is a concept, active meaning making in learning ecologies, and that was mentioned quite a bit in the qualitative data. And you could make an argument that a lot of the tools that were being used or used for active learning modalities, especially things like collaborative writing. Assessment and feedback was also mentioned, and recursive feedback is a construct in e-learning ecologies, and that was brought up quite a bit as well. In the qualitative data and in the quantitative data, we find that those like things like proctoring and exams were used quite a bit in various modalities as well. So in terms of the NGDLE, we had tons of comments about integration and interoperability. That would tend to be the case because those are some of the questions that I asked. But besides that, we saw something that I didn't expect was a ton of comments about UDL and collaboration again. So I did ask a question about universal design for learning. And so I had some qualitative data there, quantitative data there, but the qualitative stuff came through with affordances for UDL being mentioned all over the place, and also specifically accessibility and affordances for FERPA. So, so UDL is a little bit more broad than that, but accessibility and UDL more generally was mentioned quite a bit. So there are a lot more ways that I can look at some of this data. I was a little overwhelmed by it, but I think this was a really instructive first look at some of the different ways I can compare the various questions that were asked and sort of create new variables and find ways to look at it. The qualitative data was really fun to take a look at too, because people left in comments that were sort of all over the place, and just a ton of context that let me look at the topics a little more deeply. So I'm going to continue working on it and using this data, but this has been a really valuable experience, and I thank you all for watching. Thanks.